The night was quiet inside the Miller household. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound that seemed to break the silence. On the living room couch sat James Miller, a seasoned detective known throughout the department for his relentless pursuit of child abduction cases. But tonight, he wasn't the tough, methodical officer his colleagues knew him to be. Tonight, he was simply a father, sitting alone, weighed down by helplessness. In the adjacent room, a dim nightlight cast a soft glow over a small bed where his 5-year-old daughter, Emily Carter, lay curled up. Her eyes were wide open, but she hadn't spoken a word in weeks. The sparkle that once danced in her eyes had vanished, replaced by a hollow, distant gaze. The trauma of the recent kidnapping attempt, narrowly escaped thanks to the intervention of the police, had left its mark. Emily was the only witness to the terrifying encounter with Sullivan, a dangerous criminal. Though she was safe now, she seemed trapped in a world of silence and fear. James had tried everything: therapists, specialists, close family members, hoping something would reach her. But nothing worked. Emily wouldn't speak, wouldn't respond. She flinched at sudden movements, avoided eye contact, and curled deeper into herself with each passing day. But there was one constant presence she never pushed away: Rex, the family's loyal German shepherd, a retired K-9 who had once served alongside James in countless operations. The bond between Rex and James was strong, forged through years of trust and teamwork. Now, unexpectedly, Rex was becoming something even more important: a lifeline for Emily. Every morning, Rex would wait patiently by Emily's door. He never barked or nudged, he simply lay there, his steady eyes watching, his breathing calm, as if silently telling her, "I'm here. You're safe." At first, Emily barely acknowledged him. She remained curled under her blankets, eyes fixed on the wall. But Rex never gave up. Day by day, the routine continued. Rex would walk beside her quietly when she was coaxed out of bed. He would sit at her feet during mealtimes, following her movements without imposing. At night, he positioned himself near her bed, ears perked, always alert but never intrusive. It was as though Rex understood her pain in a way no human could. Then one morning, James noticed something different. As Rex gently placed a worn-out stuffed toy, the one Emily used to love, at her feet, Emily's fingers twitched. She reached out hesitantly, brushing her hand against Rex's fur. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but to James, it felt monumental. Over the next few days, the change grew. Emily began sitting next to Rex, sometimes resting her head against his thick coat. She smiled faintly when Rex licked her cheek or pawed playfully at her toy. And then one evening, as the house bathed in the soft glow of twilight, James heard a fragile, whispered sound: "Rex." It was the first word she had spoken since that terrible night. Tears filled James's eyes as he watched his daughter wrap her tiny arms around Rex's neck, her fingers gripping tightly, as if anchoring herself to the only thing that felt safe in the world. In that moment, he understood. Rex wasn't just protecting Emily, he was helping her heal, patiently guiding her back from the darkness she had fallen into. The courtroom was filled with an air of tense anticipation. Reporters whispered quietly in the back rows, while police officers stood watchful near the entrance. At the center of it all sat Richard Hale, better known by his alias, Sullivan, the man responsible for the string of child abductions, including the recent attempt on Emily Carter. Detective James Miller sat near the front, his face unreadable but his jaw tight. Beside him, holding his hand, was Emily. Her small figure looked fragile against the heavy wooden benches, but she had insisted on being here. And flanking her side, as always, was Rex, sitting calmly, his sharp eyes never leaving her. It had taken weeks of gentle reassurance, of Rex's unwavering presence, to bring Emily to this point. She hadn't spoken much since that night, but when James explained how important it was to stop Sullivan for good, she quietly nodded. Today, she wanted to face her fear, not alone, but with Rex by her side. As Sullivan was led in, shackled and expressionless, Emily's grip on James's hand tightened. She glanced at Rex, who leaned into her gently, his quiet strength radiating. Encouraged, she stood when the prosecutor asked if she could identify the man who tried to take her. There was a long pause. Then her voice, small but steady, rang out, That's him. He's the one. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused for a moment, recognizing the bravery in her simple declaration. James placed his hand on Emily's shoulder, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in months, he saw a glimmer of the fearless little girl he knew. In the days following the courtroom testimony, Detective James Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still lingered beneath the surface. Even though Emily's brave testimony had put Sullivan behind bars, James's instincts told him it wasn't over yet. Late at night, when the house fell silent and Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, James would sit alone, replaying Sullivan's words, the hidden smirk he caught glimpses of in court. There was something Sullivan hadn't told them, something unfinished. Determined to uncover it, James revisited every detail of the case files. Soon, a disturbing clue surfaced, a mention of an isolated property deep in the forest, one that hadn't yet appeared in any official reports. James didn't hesitate. He assembled a small unit, and as always, Rex was by his side, alert and ready. The forest road was long and winding, the canopy thick enough to block out much of the daylight. The deeper they ventured, the more the unease settled in. Finally, they arrived. An old, dilapidated cabin stood before them, partially hidden behind overgrown brush. Its windows were shattered, the door slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. Something about the place felt wrong. Abandoned, yet somehow lived in. James gave the signal. Guns drawn, they approached cautiously. Rex moved ahead, nose low to the ground, ears perked. He paused near the entrance, growling low, sensing something inside. The team exchanged tense glances. Then James stepped forward, pushing the door open fully. The air inside was thick with must and decay. Shadows danced across peeling wallpaper. This wasn't just a hideout. James felt it in his gut. There was more hidden here, and whatever it was, they were about to uncover it. The inside of the cabin was dim and eerily silent. Every step of the officers creaked against the worn wooden floorboards. James's flashlight cut through the darkness, scanning overturned furniture, empty bottles, and discarded scraps of paper. It was clear someone had been here recently. Rex moved ahead, nose twitching, his body tense but controlled. He paused suddenly near a corner of the room, his head tilting toward a barely visible doorway tucked behind a curtain. James approached cautiously and pushed the curtain aside, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air grew colder as they made their way down. A faint, almost imperceptible sound echoed, a soft whimper, followed by a cough. James's heart raced. At the bottom of the stairs was a locked door, rusted and heavy. Without hesitation, he forced it open. What he saw made him freeze. In the small, windowless basement sat a frail woman huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped protectively around a little girl no more than 2 years old. Both were gaunt, their faces pale and eyes hollow. The woman's clothes hung loosely on her frame, her lips cracked and skin bruised. But it wasn't just their physical condition that struck James. It was the haunted, defeated look in her eyes, the same look he had seen in Emily's not long ago. For a moment, the woman flinched as James approached, pulling her daughter closer. But then she caught sight of Rex, who stood beside James, his gaze gentle yet alert. Something shifted. Her eyes softened, filled with cautious hope. James knelt beside them. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "You're safe now." Carefully, he lifted the little girl into his arms. She was light as a feather, her small fingers weakly grasping his shirt. The woman struggled to stand, her legs trembling. Without words, she clung to James's arm as Rex walked beside them, leading the way back into the light. As they stepped out of the cabin into the fresh air, the woman's eyes squinted at the sunlight, perhaps the first she'd seen in weeks. James looked down at her face and felt his breath catch. The curve of her cheek, the softness in her eyes, it was hauntingly familiar. For a fleeting second, it was as if he was staring at a ghost from his past. Memories of late nights spent with his wife, her gentle smile, her calming presence, all came flooding back. His chest tightened, not from grief, but from something unexpected, a fragile thread of hope. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. The sterile white walls seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the fragile forms lying in the hospital beds. The woman, whose name James would later learn was Lena, slept fitfully, her face pale but no longer hollow with fear. Beside her, in a smaller bed, her 2-year-old daughter clutched a worn teddy bear, her breathing slow and shallow. Detective James Miller sat nearby, his elbows resting on his knees, exhaustion evident in his eyes. He had barely left the hospital since bringing them in. The memory of finding them locked away haunted him, and he couldn't bring himself to leave their side. But he wasn't alone. Across the room, little Emily Carter quietly placed a small stuffed animal on the bed next to Lena's daughter. She had been there every day, quietly observing, her big eyes filled with concern. Rex lay calmly at her feet, occasionally glancing up as if checking to make sure everything was still okay. The hospital staff had noticed too. Nurses smiled gently when they saw Emily arrive, always accompanied by Rex, always carrying something small, a flower, a toy, even a drawing, to leave at the bedside. It was remarkable how this tiny girl, who had once been so deeply broken, now poured so much care and attention into the two strangers. James couldn't help but watch her closely. The same child who used to tremble at the sound of a door closing now sat confidently by Lena's daughter's bed, softly humming lullabies. She wasn't just healing, she was helping others heal too. Days passed, and gradually Lena regained strength. Her daughter's cheeks began to show hints of color. There were moments when Lena would wake up disoriented, only to find Emily gently holding her daughter's hand, Rex's calm gaze meeting hers from across the room. One evening, as Lena stirred awake, she looked around at the unfamiliar hospital, at her daughter sleeping peacefully, and then at James sitting quietly nearby. Their eyes met, and she offered a faint, grateful smile. It was the first time she had smiled since she arrived. James returned the smile, feeling something shift deep inside him. He wasn't sure when it happened, but it was clear. A connection had formed, not only between him and Lena but between Emily, Rex, and the fragile little family they had rescued. As the days turned into weeks, something gentle yet undeniable began to take root. Detective James Miller found himself lingering longer in the hospital room, not out of duty, but out of something deeper. Every time Lena smiled faintly at Emily's gestures, every time her daughter giggled softly when Rex nuzzled her hand, James felt a warmth stir quietly within him. Lena, once wary and withdrawn, now responded more openly. Her eyes no longer carried the same haunted weight. Instead, there was gratitude, even comfort, whenever she looked at James. And something more, something neither of them voiced but both understood. Emily, too, had become inseparable from Lena's little girl. The two children, though years apart, seemed to fill spaces in each other's lives that had long been empty. Watching them play side by side, sharing toys, exchanging quiet smiles, felt as natural as breathing. And Rex, always watchful, remained at the center of it all, lying calmly between them like a guardian, silently ensuring everything stayed whole. James realized somewhere along the way that what had begun as a rescue had slowly transformed. They weren't strangers anymore. They were becoming something closer to family. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across the room. Lena stood by the window, her daughter perched on her hip, gazing quietly at the world outside. Her health had returned, though faint shadows of past hardships still lingered in her eyes. James watched her from the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, heart pounding with unspoken words. Behind him, Emily sat on the floor with Lena's daughter, gently showing her how to arrange the tiny puzzle pieces scattered between them. Rex lay nearby, content and alert, tail thumping lightly against the floor. Taking a deep breath, James finally stepped forward. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. Lena turned, eyes searching his face. "This house," he continued, voice steady but soft, "this life, it's been missing something for a long time. I see the way Emily looks at your little girl. I see how Rex won't leave your side. And if I'm honest, I see it in myself too." He paused, nervous for the first time in years. Said, "Let's figure it out together." Lena's lips parted, caught between surprise and something deeper, relief, maybe even hope. She glanced at Emily and her daughter, both giggling softly, then at Rex, who seemed to understand without a word. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper, "We'd like that." James felt the weight in his chest finally lift. It wasn't grand gestures or perfect timing. It was the quiet understanding that, somehow, in the midst of brokenness, they had pieced something whole together. In that quiet moment, beneath the morning light, a new family was formed, not bound by blood but by healing, trust, and love. Weeks later, life at the Miller household felt different, warmer, fuller. Emily's laughter echoed through the rooms as she chased Lena's daughter down the hallway, Rex happily trotting behind them. Lena stood in the kitchen, sunlight pouring over her face as she helped James prepare breakfast, a quiet smile resting on her lips. It was simple, unspoken, but undeniable. They had become a family. They had all carried scars, Emily with her silence, Lena with her fear, James with his quiet loneliness. But somehow, through love, patience, and loyalty, they had helped heal each other. And at the heart of it all was Rex, the silent guardian who never gave up, who taught them that trust can be rebuilt and broken souls can find their way home. Sometimes, family isn't defined by blood but by the people and the loyal companions who choose to stay.